all of this leads to, it's a breeding ground for a revolt, and a revolt would come. But as is often the case with revolts, the revolt actually doesn't start because of the desecration of the temple. It starts because of an incident in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere between an obscure priest and an obscure Assyrian officer. I'll give you a moment to admire the photo.
Ooh. Ah.
This is the hills of Judea, or the Judean desert. And it is in these hills that the partisans arose in the forest and the Maccabean Revolt started. 167 BC, the Maccabean Revolt starts when a priest from Modin named Mattathias refuses to commit apostasy ordered by the king's men in Modin, and we're going to see what that was in a moment. Mattathias ends up killing both an officer of the king and a Jew that agreed to the forced Hellenization. And it is that incident that kicks off this whole revolt. So it's not the desecration of the temple. It's this one incident in the middle of nowhere. How many of you even heard of Modin? I mean, it's nowhere in the Judean hills, and this is what kicks off the great revolt. And here's a description of it from 1 Maccabees. When he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin according to the king's demand. So the king is demanding that they do kind of Greek religious rituals. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal and his heart stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." Then he and his sons fled to the hills, which you saw in the previous slide, and left all that they had in the town. This is the beginning of the revolt, and as often happens, the leaders of a revolt have to give up everything they have. Mattathias would only live for another year, so he starts the revolt, but he is not the one who executes it, and he is not the one who ultimately wins the battle. He puts it under the leadership of his 5 sons, most prominently Judas, who is called Judas the Hammer, like in Worldwide Wrestling. And that's what Maccabeus means, Judas the Hammer. So when we talk about the Maccabean Revolt, we're actually saying the Hammer Revolt. It's done, and it's called that in honor of Judas the Hammer. 3 of the brothers would lead rebel forces in secession: Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. 2 would rise to the position of high priest and ruler of Judea: Jonathan and Simon. Certainly, if Judas had lived, he would have eventually become leader of Israel, but he died before Israel got its freedom. When Mattathias was on his deathbed, he turned the reins of the revolt over to his son Judas. This was a little tricky, and this is why this speech is recorded, is because Judas was not the oldest son. It's just he figured, well, I need somebody to kick some serious backside. Judas is the guy I want in charge, and that's why he did that. And I think I have that. I do. I spent hours and hours preparing for every course, and I knew this was here. This is actually from Jewish antiquities. So here we're back to our buddy Josephus. Anyway, back to Mattathias. So I exhort you especially to agree with one another. So he's asking for unity among the brothers. A lot of us here have brothers. We don't necessarily always have unity among them, but he's asking for unity. And in what excellency any one of you exceeds another, to yield to him. So the same thing here. Mattathias is saying each of you has his own skills. So I ask each one of you to step back when that skill set is called for, and let the brother that has that skill execute it. So that's a smart thing to do. And by that means to reap the advantage of everyone's own virtue. So this makes all kinds of sense. How often do we do it in real life? Probably not very often, but it makes all kinds of sense to do it. Do you then esteem Simon as your father? Because he is a man of extraordinary prudence. So Simon is the prudent one. Simon has the cool head. And be governed by him in what counsel he gives you. And of course Simon eventually becomes the political leader as well as the chief priest. Take Maccabeus for the general of your army. This one was kind of a duh, I think. If you actually want to win this battle, take Maccabeus as the general, because of his courage and strength, for he will avenge your nation and will bring vengeance on your enemies. Admit among you the righteous and religious, and augment the power. This is when he turns the reins over to the sons. But the first reign, the one that's going to be most important in terms of the revolt, is Maccabeus, who's going to be the general of the army. It's later that Simon, with his prudence, or Jonathan's skills, become especially. This is actually a clip art of Judas Maccabeus. I'll give you a moment to admire. Thank you. We start with Judas Maccabeus as the head of the rebel army. 165 BC. He actually wins several battles against the Seleucids. And they're not even, the thing that's amazing about it, they're not even really fighting a guerrilla war. They had so many people that joined this revolt. They were fighting, fixed battles out in the middle of the desert. It was like Richard the Lionheart fighting against Saladin and Arsuf or something. I mean, they're out in the middle of the Judean desert, and these are just flat-out battles. This isn't a guerrilla war. That's why it's so amazing that he wins. December 164 BC is one of the most important times in the history of Israel. Judas reoccupies the temple area in Jerusalem, and he cleanses and rededicates the temple. And this is the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. So sometimes people who have read the Old Testament several times, they'll scratch their heads because, okay, I get Passover and the festival of the booths and all that, but Hanukkah is not mentioned in here. And in the course of a year, Hanukkah is probably the holiday we hear the most about, Jewish holiday, just simply because it's often connected at Christmas time. So this is where you hear about the Hanukkah is in the Apocrypha, not in the Older New Testament. So here's Hanukkah from the point of view of First Maccabees. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel. That must have been a wonderful moment. It's a shame we don't have it on videotape. Determined that every year at that season, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Chislev. So that's the beginning of Hanukkah. Here's a drawing of a Hanukkah. 160 BC, Judas falls in battle against the Syrian commander Bacchides. So Judas dies on the battlefield, and there is a wonderful eulogy to him in First Maccabees that we will, when we do First Maccabees, I'll talk about. But First Maccabees commemorates this event by using language that heretofore had only been used to describe the great kings of Israel's past, people like David or Solomon or Saul. How is the valiant man fallen that delivered Israel? So when he dies, the same thing is said about him that is said about David or Solomon. After the death of Judas, his brother Jonathan, and later his brother Simon, take over leadership of the revolt. So there's a secession that continues unvarnished. Sometimes when the leader dies, the troops get demoralized and they go home. That did not happen this time. There was an orderly secession.